New York City.
New York City. Table of contents. The Dutch made a street out of the old Indian Trail and called it Breedweg or Broadway, a name that it has retained to this day.
Broadway is a street in Manhattan that starts at the lower end of Manhattan and then follows an old Indian trail diagonally up to the northern end of the island. The island of Manhattan is 12 miles long and 2.5 miles wide. The Bronx is the only borough of the 5 boroughs of New York City that is on the mainland, and the other 4 are on islands.
Let's first look at Broadway as a place. A street on the island of Manhattan in New York City. Broadway begins at the southern tip of Manhattan and runs the full length of the island to the northern tip at the Harlem River.
The history of Broadway even predates the days of New Amsterdam. It was originally an Indian path, probably for trade goods, all of the way across Manhattan, and then an easy crossing over the narrow Harlem River to the mainland. Then, it was an easy route by land or water up the Hudson River Valley, all the way out to present-day Albany.
The old Indian Trail was called the Aqueduct Trail and ran from the southern tip of Manhattan all of the way north across the island to the Harlem River and then up the Hudson River Valley to the Mohawk River near present-day Albany. The Dutch explorer and entrepreneur David de Vries, in his journal for the year 1642, gives the first mention of it. The Aqueduct road over which the Indians passed daily.
Broadway was the first main street laid out in New Amsterdam. Note that Wall Street was so named because it ran along the protective wall of the settlement. Fort Amsterdam was at the beginning of Broadway, at the lower tip of Manhattan.
This is a map of New York in 1695. Note that the settlement now extends just a few blocks beyond the wall at Wall Street. This is a map of New York in 1729, now under British control. Note that the settlement now extends just several blocks beyond Wall Street, and includes a common, King's Farm, and a freshwater pond. Note that the wall is no longer there, and Broadway is spelled as 2 words. Broadway. Note also that many of the street names have been changed to English.
This a map of New York in 1730. Now an English colonial city, under British control. Note that the settlement now extends a considerable distance up from Wall Street. Also, note the Collect Pond, which will serve as a major source of fresh water for the growing city until the completion of the old Croton Aqueduct in 1842.
This is New Amsterdam today.
Except for the streets in the lower tip of Manhattan, especially in the area that was New Amsterdam, the streets follow a rectangular grid pattern. The big exception is Broadway, which runs in somewhat of a diagonal direction.
It is the diagonal path of Broadway intersecting the rectangular grid pattern that gives rise to the several so-called squares, such as Times Square, Herald Square, and Madison Square, that are actually acute triangles and not geometrical squares. An example is Madison Square in the Flatiron Building, where Broadway crosses 5th Avenue at 23rd Street.
Another example is where Broadway crosses Amsterdam Avenue, producing triangular slivers of land called Sherman Square and Verdi Square.
Here is Broadway in Lower Manhattan. Battery Park is at the southern tip of the island, and the Wall Street Financial District is just to the north of that. This is a view up Broadway from Bowling Green at the lower tip of Manhattan, with the Chrysler Building visible in the background.
This is a view of Broadway from Canal Street, looking north to beyond Niblo's Garden in 1834.
This is a view of Broadway from City Hall Park in 1836. Just to the east of Broadway in Lower Manhattan are the Lower East Side, City Hall, and Chinatown. The first theater district was in this part of Broadway in Lower Manhattan. It later moved uptown, first to Herald Square at 34th Street, and then later to Times Square near 42nd Street.
It is in this Lower East Side area that many of the immigrant groups that were so instrumental in the development of the Broadway theater settled.
Here is the Lower East Side around the year 1900. 1800s. 1800. The population of New York City reached 60,000, 1811. Commissioner's Plan of 1811 lays out the Manhattan grid between 14th Street and Washington Heights. 1825. The population of New York City reached 166,000. The Erie Canal began operating 1831. The University of the City of New York was incorporated 1835. December 16th. The New York Stock Exchange and hundreds of other buildings are destroyed by the Great Fire, which rages for 2 days in the financial district. 1842. The Croton Aqueduct began operating 1847. The Free Academy of the City of New York was founded, later renamed City College of New York.
1850. The population of New York City reached 550,000. 1858. Central Park opens. 1859. Co-op Union for the Advancement of Science and Art established. 1860. The population of New York City reached 814,000. 1863. New York draft riots. Over 100 are killed. 1865. President Abraham Lincoln's funeral procession stops for a day, and Lincoln lies in state at City Hall.
1870. Hunter College established 1871. Tweed Scandal. Grand Central Depot opens 1872. New York City's population reached 1 million people. Metropolitan Museum of Art opens. Bloomingdale's opens 1878. St. Patrick's Cathedral opens.
1880. Metropolitan Opera Company founded. The population of New York City reached 1.2 million 1882. Pearl Street Electric Power Station begins operating 1883. Brooklyn Bridge opens. Metropolitan Opera House, 39th Street, opens. Life magazine begins publication 1886. Statue of Liberty dedicated 1888. George Washington Bridge built. The population of
1890. The population of New York City reached 1.7 million 1891. Carnegie Hall opens 1892. Ellis Island U.S. Immigrant Inspection Station begins operating. 1897. Grant's Tomb completed 1898. Greater New York was created on January 1, 1898. Consolidating the existing city of New York with the eastern Bronx, Brooklyn, most of Queens County, and Staten Island 1899. The Park Row building is completed, becoming the tallest in New York City, at 391 feet, 119 meters. The Bronx Zoo opens. Now, how did New York City become the largest and most influential city in the United States? And how did New York City become the largest and most influential city in the U.S.? How did the Broadway of Manhattan obtain its preeminent position as the center of the American dramatic and musical theater?
Why didn't Boston or Philadelphia or Baltimore, or even Charleston rise to become center of the musical and dramatic theater in the United States?
Why not Market Street in Philadelphia? or Boylston Street in Boston, Charles Street in Baltimore, or even Charleston in South Carolina. All of these were great ports in colonial days, and of a size to rival New York City. The answer has to do primarily with geography and access to the hinterland, and the Great Barrier posed by the Appalachian Mountains.
The original 13 colonies were confined to a strip along the Atlantic coast, between the Atlantic Ocean and the Appalachian Mountains. After the French and Indian War ended in 1763, the entire territory between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, known as the Northwest Territory, was open for settlement. The Appalachian Mountains were a formidable barrier for the transportation of people, agricultural produce, and goods between the Northwest Territory and the regions east of the mountains. As the settlement of the region west of the mountains increased in the early 1800s, there was increasing interest in establishing a transportation route across the mountains. The lowest cost means of transportation at that time, before the advent of the railroads in the mid-1800s, was canals. The Erie Canal.
The Appalachian Mountains were a barrier to transportation from Maine to northern Georgia. There was only one gap that made a canal feasible. That was the Mohawk Valley in upstate New York.
In the early 1800s, it was proposed that a canal be dug from the Hudson River near Albany, through the Mohawk River Valley to Lake Erie.
This shows the topography of the region. Note the Erie Canal through the Mohawk Valley in the broad gap between the Adirondack and Catskill Mountains.
The result was the Erie Canal.
This would establish an all-water transportation route from New York City, up the Hudson River to Albany, and then on the Erie Canal, from Albany to Lake Erie near Buffalo. Construction on the Erie Canal started in 1817. By 1825, the canal was completed at a cost of little over $7 million.
Governor DeWitt Clinton and the state of New York were able to build a waterway that was 4 feet deep, 40 feet wide, and 363 miles long, connecting the Hudson River at Albany to Lake Erie, near Buffalo. The canal was the most ambitious engineering project undertaken anywhere in the country up to that time. New York City. The rise to prominence.
This Erie Canal and Hudson River water route opened up the vast and fertile Midwest and linked it to the east coast of the U.S. at New York City. Agricultural products from the Midwest could now be shipped inexpensively to New York City and then to other ports along the East Coast and to Europe. Manufactured products from Europe could now be shipped to New York City and then inexpensively to the Midwest.
New York City was the center of all of this trade, and grew rapidly to become the largest city in the U.S.
In addition, large numbers of immigrants came from Europe to New York City.
Many went on to the West, but many stayed in New York City, giving it a large and cosmopolitan immigrant population. It is thus, this rise to prominence of New York City, together with the financial power and the various immigrant groups, that produced the phenomenon known as Broadway.
The question still remains as to why Boston, or Philadelphia, or Baltimore, or even Charleston, did not rise to become the center of the musical and dramatic theater in the United States.
Although Boston was a leading city in early America, a canal route to the west was blocked by the Berkshire Mountains in western Massachusetts, and the Adirondacks in eastern New York State.
Philadelphia was the largest city in colonial America. The Allegheny Mountains, however, were a major barrier to canal building. Also, the major rivers in western Pennsylvania, the Delaware and the Susquehanna, ran mostly north to south.
The Port of Philadelphia was established more than 300 years ago during the colonial period, and was for a time the busiest port in both that period and the earliest years of the new republic.
Philadelphia had the disadvantage, however, of being located 103 miles up the Delaware River from the ocean, and was finally eclipsed by the Port of New York.
The Pennsylvania Canal, which connected Philadelphia to the Ohio River at Pittsburgh, was completed in 1834. However, by that time New York City, with its Erie Canal, completed almost 10 years earlier, had an unbeatable head start.
The Pennsylvania Canal faced far more obstacles than did the Erie Canal in going over the rugged Allegheny Mountains. Inclined planes and portage railroads were needed in some sections, making it far more expensive than the Erie Canal, and it was never profitable.
In 1852 the Pennsylvania Railroad was completed over the Allegheny Mountains from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, rendering the canal obsolete.
Later there were connections to the Great Lakes and the entire Midwest. However, a railroad connection paralleling the Erie Canal all of the way to the Great Lakes at Buffalo had been completed by 1842, so New York City maintained its primacy.
The geography that led to the leading role of New York City was also a factor in Pittsburgh. Situated at the beginning of the Ohio River at the confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers.
The development of steamboats in the 1840s and the arrival of the railroad in 1852 made Pittsburgh a major transportation and industrial center.
Baltimore was also a major city and port in colonial America. Again here, as in the case of Boston and Philadelphia, the mountains were a major barrier to canal building.
The Chesapeake and Ohio Canal was started in 1828 from a point near Washington, D.C., and was originally intended to reach the Ohio River at Pittsburgh. The canal was completed in 1850, but went only a distance of 185 miles to Cumberland, Maryland.
The Chesapeake and Ohio Canal was soon superseded by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which eventually went over the mountains to reach the Ohio River at Wheeling, Virginia, which is now West Virginia, in 1853. Although this gave Baltimore a big boost as a port, it was too late to compete with New York City.
In the case of Charleston, South Carolina, it was much further from the major European ports than New York City, and also the distance to the Midwest was much greater. So, it was never a serious contender.
In the Midwest, the Ohio and Erie Canal was completed in 1832 between Portsmouth on the Ohio River and Cleveland on Lake Erie. It gave rise to the great growth of Cleveland but was no match for the Erie Canal and New York City. Similarly, the Miami and Erie Canal was completed in 1845 between Cincinnati on the Ohio River and Toledo on Lake Erie. It gave rise to the great growth of both Cincinnati and Toledo, but again it was no match for the Erie Canal and New York City. The Maumee River was originally called the Miami River, so there were at one time two Miami rivers in Ohio, both named after the same Ottawa tribe, the Miami, and not to be confused with the Miami of Florida. The two Miami regions of Ohio, North and South, were however connected in 1845 by the Miami and Erie Canal between Toledo and Cincinnati.
Railroads to the west. These are travel times in the early 1800s. Before canals and railroads, travel times were exceptionally long. It would take a week to reach western New York State and 6 weeks to reach Chicago.
These are travel times in 1830. Completing the Erie Canal and the canals in the east significantly decreased the travel time to the Great Lakes region. It would now take only a few days to get to western New York State, but require 2 weeks to reach Chicago.
The New York Central Railroad was established in 1853, consolidating several existing railroad companies.
This is a map of the water level route of the New York Central Railroad, purple, the West Shore Railroad, red, and the Erie Canal, blue. In 1842, a continuous line, which would become the New York Central Railroad and its Auburn Road in 1853, was open the whole way to Buffalo. As the railroad served the same general route as the Erie Canal but provided for faster travel, passengers soon switched to it. However, as late as 1852, the canal carried 13 times more freight tonnage than all the railroads in New York State combined. It continued to compete well with the railroads through 1882 when tolls were abolished. These are travel times in 1857. The railroad significantly decreased the travel times east of the Mississippi River. It would now take only a day to get to western New York State, and even Ohio, and just 2 days to reach Chicago. The New York Central was known as the water level route, as its main line to New York City ran along the Hudson River and the shores of Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. This is an 1876 map of the New York Central Railroad. Now, the entire country is accessible from New York City within a matter of days.
This is an 1893 map of the New York Central Railroad. Almost any place in the country is now accessible from New York City within a matter of days.
This is a map of the New York Central Railroad in 1926.
The New York Central Railroad operated mainly in the Great Lakes and Mid-Atlantic regions of the United States. The railroad primarily connected Greater New York and Boston in the east with Chicago and St. Louis in the Midwest.
The Pennsylvania Railroad is known as the standard railway of the world, although it initially had Philadelphia as its eastern starting port. Later, the tracks extended to New York City.
This is an 1879 map showing the main railroad lines in the U.S.
New York City and its great port facilities of New York and New Jersey have since retained their place as the leading East Coast port in cargo tonnage by a very large margin over Hampton Roads, Virginia, 10th place, Savannah, 13th, Baltimore, 18th and Philadelphia, 23rd.
These are the busiest container ports in the United States by number of TEUs in millions. A TEU is a 20-foot equivalent unit that describes the capacity of container ships and container terminals. It is basically a 20-foot-long container. More often, you will see 40-foot-long containers commonly pulled by a semi-trailer truck. These are equivalent to 2 TEUs.
We see that the port of New York and New Jersey is by a very large margin the busiest U.S. East Coast port. And only the West Coast ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach have a higher container traffic. The port of New York and New Jersey is the port district of the New York-Newark metropolitan area. It encompasses the region within approximately a 25-mile, 40 kilometers, radius of the Statue of Liberty National Monument. The port of New York in the early days was mainly on the East River in Lower Manhattan, and then gradually shifted to the Hudson River side in Midtown Manhattan.
This is a map of New York in 1766, 10 years before the beginning of the American Revolution. Note the many wharves, or slips, in Lower Manhattan, especially on the East River side. Note also the Brooklyn, or Brooklyn Ferry Terminal. In particular, the great passenger liners of the golden age of transatlantic liners dock in Midtown Manhattan. These are ocean liners docked at the New York passenger ship terminal. Circa 1960. On the Hudson River between West 44th and West 54th Street. Much of the Manhattan waterfront became obsolete by the 1970s due to changing transportation patterns, particularly containerized shipping and much larger cargo ships.
The first facility for container shipping in the U.S. opened in 1962 at new terminals at Newark Bay, New Jersey. This shift to the New Jersey terminals was also due to the expanded intermodal freight transport systems and the interstate highway system.
Since the 1980s, waterfront sections in the traditional harbor have been redeveloped to include public access to the water's edge, with the creation of linear park greenways such as Hudson River Park, Hudson River Waterfront Walkway, and Brooklyn Bridge Park.
The Port of New York and New Jersey includes the navigable waterways in the New York-New Jersey Harbor Estuary,
which runs along over 770 miles, 1,240 kilometers, of shoreline in the vicinity of New York City and northeastern New Jersey, and is one of the largest natural harbors in the world.
The Port of New York and New Jersey has long been the busiest port on the east coast of the U.S. and is a major economic engine for the region.
These are the cargo terminals of the Port of New York and New Jersey. This port has 6 major container terminals covering 1,500 acres.
The port serves every major ocean carrier, and it is the first port of call for 75% of the ships. The port also has 3 passenger terminals for cruise ships: Cape Liberty in Bayonne, New Jersey, the Brooklyn Cruise Terminal, and the Manhattan Cruise Terminal. The Manhattan Cruise Ship Terminal is on the Hudson River between West 44th and West 52nd Streets. Both Newark International Airport and LaGuardia Airport are 15 miles, 24 kilometers, away, and JFK International Airport is 20 miles, 32 kilometers, distant.
The Brooklyn Cruise Port Terminal is in the Red Hook area of Brooklyn, across from Governor's Island. LaGuardia Airport is 12 miles away. Newark International Airport is 16 miles away. And JFK International Airport is 20 miles away.
The Jersey Cape Liberty Cruise Terminal opened in 2014 in Bayonne, New Jersey. It is close to the EWR Newark Liberty Airport, only 10 miles, 16 kilometers, to the west. It is just 20 minutes by car from the airport and easy to access, skipping the heavy traffic and bridges of New York City. The Port of New York and New Jersey is located in the largest consumer market in North America, situated within 700 miles of the major cities and population centers. It serves over 125 million people with over $200 billion of cargo value.
These are the top 10 North American ports ranked by container volume. Although the Port of Los Angeles Long Beach is by far the busiest due to a brisk trade with Asia, the Port of New York and New Jersey is the next in line.
The Port Authority of New York and New Jersey was established in 1921 in addition to the facilities of the ports. It is responsible for vehicular crossings, the rapid transit system between New York and New Jersey, and the airports of the region. The airports of the New York City region, principally Liberty Airport in Newark, EWR, LaGuardia, LGA, in Queens, and the John F. Kennedy International, JFK, also in Queens, make it the nation's top gateway for international flights and its busiest center for overall passenger and air freight flights.
The Croton Aqueduct.
Water everywhere, but not a drop to drink. The Hudson River is a tidal estuary as far north of Manhattan as the Tappan Zee, 16 miles, and typically has more ocean water than river water in the mix. Brackish water can actually work its way about 70 miles north of New York City to Poughkeepsie in droughts.
The East River is a tidal strait in New York City connecting Upper New York Bay on its south end to Long Island Sound on its north end. So, the river water around the city is unsuitable for drinking.
New York City has a lot of water, principally the Hudson and East Rivers. But it is brackish and polluted, so it is unsuitable for drinking and other purposes. New York City's pristine Collect Pond was a freshwater source for New Yorkers for nearly 200 years. What happened to it?
The Collect Pond, or freshwater pond, was a body of fresh water fed by an underground spring in what is now Chinatown in Lower Manhattan, New York City. For the first 2 centuries of European settlement in Manhattan, it was the primary New York City water supply system for the growing city.
In the early days, when the population was tiny, water from wells, springs, and rainwater was sufficient. Around 1677, the first public well was constructed. However, as the population grew, from 60,000 in 1800 to 200,000 in 1830, and especially after the opening of the Erie Canal in 1825, these sources of water proved to be woefully inadequate.
Fortunately, New York City has fresh water sources in 2 vast watersheds north of the city in the Catskill Mountains. Furthermore, the watershed is at an elevation of about 600 feet above the city, so that water flow can be by means of gravity. As a result, 97% of the water reaches homes and businesses through gravity alone.
And only 3% must be pumped to its final destination. Chlorine is added to the water to kill bacteria, and fluoride is added to help prevent tooth decay. More than 90% of New York City's water supply comes from the Catskill-Delaware watershed, about 125 miles north of the city. The other 10% comes from the Croton watershed. These watersheds extend over 1 million acres, both publicly and privately owned, and are highly regulated to ensure contaminants stay out of the water.
The New York City drinking water supply system is the largest unfiltered water supply in the United States. It provides approximately 1.2 billion gallons of high-quality drinking water to nearly 1/2 the population of New York State every day. This includes 8 million residents of New York City and 1 million consumers located in the nearby counties Ulster, Orange, Putnam, and Westchester.
This is the largest watershed, the Catskill-Delaware watershed, located about 125 miles north of New York City.
The water is impounded in several reservoirs and then flows to the city through the Catskill Aqueduct and the Delaware Aqueduct.
The Croton system is in Westchester, Putnam, and Dutchess counties, with 12 reservoirs and 3 controlled lakes. The largest, the New Croton Reservoir, can hold 19 billion gallons of water. The system normally supplies 10% of the city's drinking water, but can supply more when there is a drought in the watersheds farther upstate. The Catskill system includes 2 reservoirs and supplies up to 40% of the city's daily needs. The Catskill watershed is in parts of Greene, Ulster, and Schoharie counties, about 100 miles north of New York City and 35 miles west of the Hudson River. The Delaware system, in parts of Delaware, Ulster, and Sullivan counties southwest of the Catskill watershed, includes 4 reservoirs that provide 50% of the city's daily water needs. It is about 120 miles north of the city. The largest reservoir is the Pipacton, which can hold over 140 billion gallons of water. That is more than the entire capacity of the Croton system.
This is a profile view of the 92-mile-long Catskill Aqueduct, which plunges 1,100 feet underneath the Hudson River. Construction started in 1907 and was completed in 1916.
The water flow in this entire system is by gravity at a speed of 4 feet per second or 3 miles per hour. So it takes 40 hours, or about 2 days, for water from the reservoirs in the Catskills to reach the city. After being stored in the Hillview Reservoir, the water is distributed throughout the city. The capacity of the Hillview Reservoir is 900 million gallons.
This is enough water to supply the city for 1 day. The water pressure is enough to send it up to the 6th floor of most buildings.
Water from the Croton Catskill and Delaware aqueducts then flows through large underground tunnels for distribution throughout New York City.
The construction of the third water tunnel, one of the largest capital projects in the city's history, is being completed in phases. The tunnel will carry water to all 5 boroughs and allow much-needed inspections on tunnels 1 and 2, which have been in continuous use since they were built in 1917 and 1936, respectively. The first major water supply for New York City was the Croton Aqueduct or Old Croton Aqueduct. It was a large and complex water distribution system constructed between 1837 and 1842. The Great Aqueducts, which were among the first in the United States, carried water by gravity 41 miles, 66 kilometers, from the Croton River in Westchester County to reservoirs in Manhattan. The Croton Aqueduct was built because local water resources had become polluted and inadequate for the growing population of the city. Although the old Croton Aqueduct was largely superseded by the new Croton Aqueduct, which was built in 1890, the old Croton Aqueduct remained in service until 1955.
This is the old Croton Aqueduct. This is the old Croton Dam.
New York City in the Civil War.
This is New York City at the time of the Civil War. This city, as the largest in the U.S., played an important role in the Civil War, supplying men and material and forming public opinion through its important newspapers. The Cooper Union Speech or Address, known at the time as the Cooper Institute Speech, was delivered by Abraham Lincoln on February 27, 1860, at Cooper Union in New York City.
Lincoln was not yet a Republican nominee for the presidency. As the convention was scheduled for May, it is considered one of his most important speeches. Some historians have argued that the speech was responsible for his victory in the presidential election later that year.
The Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art is a private college at Cooper Square in New York City. Peter Cooper founded the institution in 1859 after learning about the government-supported École Polytechnique in France.
The Cooper Union was based on Cooper's belief that an education equal to the best technology schools established should be accessible to those who qualify, independent of their race, religion, sex, wealth or social status, and should be open and free to all. The New York City draft riots were a violent reaction to the conscription laws passed by the U.S. Congress to draft men for the Civil War. These riots occurred from July 13 through July 16 in 1863 and caused widespread death and damage in Lower Manhattan. The Conscription Act allowed draftees to pay substitutes $300 to serve in their place. The rioters were primarily Irish working-class men, who did not want to fight in the Civil War and resented that wealthier men, who could afford to pay a $300 commutation fee to hire a substitute, were spared from the draft.
Shown here are wealthy New Yorkers mingling with working-class individuals at a downtown recruitment center. The Conscription Act allowed draftees to pay substitutes $300 to serve in their place.
This was well beyond the financial ability of most Americans. At the time, A typical laborer's wage was between $1 and $2 a day, and the fee of $300 was equivalent to $7,300 in today's money. The immediate cause of the riots was anger and resentment caused by the draft. The protests then turned into a race riot, with white rioters attacking black people throughout the city. The official death toll was listed at either 119 or 120 individuals.
Conditions in the city had deteriorated to the extent that martial law had to be imposed. Major General Johnny Wool, commander of the Department of the East, said on July 16 that martial law ought to be proclaimed. But I have not a sufficient force to enforce it.
Order began to be restored on July 16 as the New York State Militia and some federal troops were sent to New York City. And ultimately, there were several thousand militia and federal troops in the city.
The Brooklyn Bridge was opened on May 24, 1883. It was the first fixed crossing of the East River between Manhattan and Brooklyn. It was the longest suspension bridge in the world at its opening, with a main span of 1,595.5 feet, 486.3 meters, and a deck 127 feet, 38.7 meters, above the high water level of the East River. This is a panoramic illustration of the city of New York in 1876. The Brooklyn Bridge was still under construction at this time and was not drawn to scale. This is an enlargement of the center of the image of the illustration of the city of New York in 1876. Points of interest include Broadway, the Post Office, City Hall, Trinity Church, and Wall Street. This is a panoramic illustration of the city of New York in 1877. The Brooklyn Bridge was still under construction and was not drawn to scale. Note the shipping activity clustered around the lower tip of Manhattan. This is an enlargement of the center of the image of the illustration of the city of New York in 1876. Points of interest include Broadway, Grace Church, Madison Square, Fifth Avenue, and St. Patrick's Cathedral on Fifth Avenue.
This is a panoramic illustration of the city of New York in 1879. The Brooklyn Bridge was still under construction at this time and was not drawn to scale. Note that the city has now occupied the entire island of Manhattan, and there is a large population in the future boroughs of Brooklyn, Queens, and across the Hudson River in New Jersey. The span was originally called the New York and Brooklyn Bridge, or the East River Bridge, but was officially renamed the Brooklyn Bridge in 1915. The Brooklyn Bridge, the eighth wonder of the world. Proposals for a bridge, 1883. The Great Bridge. After 14 years of construction, the Brooklyn Bridge opened. Many people predicted that the physical union of New York and Brooklyn would make the political union of the two cities inevitable. The bridge was designed by John I. Roebling, the chief engineer. Roebling's son, Washington Roebling, contributed further design work, assisted by his wife, Emily Warren Roebling. The Brooklyn Bridge is 1,595 foot, 486 meter. Main span was the longest in the world until the completion of the Firth of Forth Cantilever Bridge in Scotland in 1890. The Brooklyn Bridge has undergone several reconfigurations. It carried horse-drawn vehicles and elevated railway lines until 1950. Following gradual deterioration, the Brooklyn Bridge has been renovated several times, including in the 1950s, 1980s, and 2010s.
To alleviate increasing traffic flows, additional bridges and tunnels have been built across the East River. By 1897, There were 2 other bridges across the East River, 2 across the Hudson River and several across the Harlem River, joined Manhattan to the Bronx.
Today, many bridges and tunnels connect Manhattan to the other boroughs of New York City. These are the bridges over the East River between Manhattan and the boroughs of Brooklyn, Queens and the Bronx. Listed from south to north.
The Williamsburg Bridge was the second bridge over the East River between Manhattan and Brooklyn. Opened in 1903. This is an image of Lower Manhattan in 1905, with the population now reaching 4 million. The Hudson River is to the left. The East River is to the right, crossed by the Brooklyn Bridge, 1883.
And the recently completed Williamsburg Bridge, 1903, further north. The Battery and Bowling Green are in the foreground, crossed by the elevated railroad. This is an image of Lower Manhattan in 1912. The East River is to the right, crossed by the Brooklyn Bridge, 1883. The recently completed Manhattan Bridge, 1909, just beyond. And the Williamsburg Bridge, 1903, further north. The city population has now reached 5 million. The only bridge over the Hudson River between Manhattan and New Jersey is the George Washington Bridge.
This is the George Washington Bridge over the Hudson River, opened in 1931.
The Brooklyn Bridge is the southernmost of the 4 toll-free vehicular bridges connecting Manhattan Island and Long Island, with the Manhattan Bridge, the Williamsburg Bridge, and the Queensboro Bridge to the north.
The Consolidation of New York City.
Andrew Haswell Green, 1820 to 1903, was a major force in the drive for consolidation. He was a lawyer, New York City planner, and civic leader. He is considered the father of Greater New York.
Green is responsible for Central Park, the New York Public Library, the Bronx Zoo, the American Museum of Natural History, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. His last project was the Consolidation of New York City, and he chaired the 1897 committee that drew up the plan of amalgamation.
What are boroughs? After the consolidation, New York City comprised 5 boroughs: Manhattan, the Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, and Staten Island. But what exactly is a borough? The dictionary definition of a borough is a village, town, or part of a large city that has its own government. Boroughs are found in a number of English-speaking countries. They are much more common in Great Britain than in the U.S.
The word borough itself comes from the Old English burg or burg, meaning a dwelling or dwellings within a fortified enclosure, and this derives from the Germanic burg meaning fortified place, citadel, or in German burg meaning castle, with derivatives relating to hills, hill forts, and fortified elevations. In medieval Europe, a borough was a fortified group of houses forming a town with special duties and privileges.
In the present day, it is a town or urban constituency in Great Britain that sends a member to Parliament, or an urban area incorporated for purposes of self-government. In the U.S., it is a municipality in some states, such as New Jersey and Minnesota, corresponding to the incorporated town or village of the other states. It is also one of the 5 divisions of New York City.
Alaska is the only state in the U.S. that calls its administrative districts below the state-level boroughs, rather than counties. All of the other states have counties, except for Louisiana, which has parishes.
The boroughs of New York City are also counties of New York State, but are political regions within the city. New York City has 1 mayor and city council, with representatives from each borough.
The boroughs have borough presidents, but the position is mainly symbolic with little actual authority. so the boroughs are now mainly just geographic divisions.
Consolidation was the most transformative single moment in New York City's history. When, right after midnight on January 1, 1898, the five-borough city was born.
At that instant, at the beginning of 1898, the two independent cities of Brooklyn and Long Island City, plus all the towns and villages of Richmond County, Staten Island, and a few more on Long Island, were joined with New York City, then consisting of Manhattan Island and today's Bronx, with a consolidation, as this contentious union was called. New York's population increased by 70%, and its territory expanded by a factor of 5, from about 60 square miles to over 300 square miles.
Greater New York, the second largest city in the world behind London, would be governed under an entirely new city charter, approved just a few months early. The New York Tribune called the Consolidation the greatest experiment in municipal government that the world has ever known.
The island of Manhattan was the original New York City before the annexations of 1873 through 1898. The cities of New York and Brooklyn dominate the consolidation story in the 1890s. New York City was the most populous city in the country, and Brooklyn was the third or fourth most populous. It is difficult for modern-day New Yorkers to appreciate just how empty Queens, the Bronx and Staten Island were by comparison. Here are the population figures and percentage of the entire population at the time of the consolidation. Manhattan, 1,960,000, 56%. Brooklyn, 1,180,000, 34%. The Bronx, 150,000, 4%. Queens, 140,000, 4%. Staten Island, 70,000, 2%.
1873. New York City's first expansion beyond Manhattan. The lower Westchester towns of Kingsbridge, West Farms, and Morrisania were annexed to New York City from 1855 to 1873. This is the portion of today's Bronx west of the Bronx River.
The Bronx. The territory of today's Bronx borough was annexed by New York City in 2 stages before the consolidation of 1898. It originally consisted of a handful of towns in lower Westchester County.
The towns west of the Bronx River we annexed in 1873. The towns east of the river we annexed in 1895. This non-Manhattan piece of New York City was called the Annexed District until it was renamed the Bronx with the consolidation.
Brooklyn. The territory of today's Brooklyn borough was initially occupied by 6 different towns, one of which was named Brooklyn. The town of Brooklyn kept growing throughout the 1800s, eventually becoming a city and annexing all the other towns one by one. By 1896, the city of Brooklyn filled the entire area of the original 6 towns. Staten Island. Staten Island was a collection of separate towns at the time of the consolidation. Taken together, they were called Richmond, the island's county name to this day. In fact, the original borough name was Richmond, too. But that was officially changed to the commonly used Staten Island in the 1970s.
Queens. At the time of the consolidation, the borough of Queens consisted of Long Island City and the towns of Newtown, Flushing, Jamaica, and part of the town of Hempstead.
When Queens Borough was created in 1898, it was not coextensive with Queens County. Nassau County did not exist, so Queens County extended from the East River to the Suffolk County line, and the new Queens Borough occupied only 1/3 of Queens County. In 1899, Nassau County was created out of the remainder of Queens County, and the diminished Queens County was made coextensive with Queensborough. However, the Queensborough line was altered slightly in the process, and, as a consequence, New York City lost about 12 square miles of territory.
As noted before, the boundary between Nassau County and Suffolk County marks the eastern part of Long Island. This is New Netherland from 1616 to 1664. Note the boundary between the Dutch and English settlements. Each consolidated county remained a county in relation to the state but became a borough within the city. The Bronx reunited to form a fifth borough that shared New York County with Manhattan. A separate Bronx County was established in 1914, making the present New York County coextensive with the borough, but not the island, of Manhattan.
What were the arguments, pro and con, for and against consolidation? This is Andrew Haswell Green explaining the new city. Staten Island is County of Richmond.
First, the con or against side. For the more rural, more distant regions, especially the western part of Queens County on Long Island, it was the loss of local control and autonomy. Also, the imposition of some city services that were felt unnecessary.
On the pro side, there was an acquisition of the tax base of the businesses of wealthy Manhattan to help with city services, including law enforcement, infrastructure in streets and sewers, and transportation such as subways and rail lines.
This included the advantages of the economy of scale from small local cities or towns to a very much larger metropolitan area. One major factor was acquiring the New York City water supply system of the vast upstate watersheds, reservoirs, and aqueducts. One minor factor in favor of the consolidation of New York City is the rivalry with the rapidly growing city of Chicago. It was feared that without consolidation, Chicago might become the largest city.
If Chicago did become the largest city, it was said, European banking and export firms might shift their American branches to the heartland. Corporate headquarters would soon follow. Taking professional firms along, the market prices of stocks and commodities would get set in the interior. Manufacturing would steal away. New York's property values would scud downward.
One particular case is that of the County of Queens, which initially had several smaller cities and towns, including Long Island City. The area of Queens County closest to Manhattan voted for consolidation, but the more rural and small-town areas further east in Long Island voted against it.
This eastern part of Queens County then seceded and became Nassau County. This county and Suffolk County became the eastern part of Long Island. The remaining part of Queens County became the largest borough of New York City. This is a view of the consolidated city of New York, showing the 5 boroughs. This is another view of the consolidated city of New York, showing the 5 boroughs.
This view of the consolidated city of New York shows the 5 boroughs in the 2 major waterways, the Hudson River and the East River.
This closer view of the consolidated city of New York shows Manhattan and the 2 major waterways, the Hudson River and the East River. This shows Manhattan and the 2 major waterways, the Hudson and East Rivers.
This shows Lower Manhattan and Upper New York Bay with Ellis Island, Governor's Island and Liberty Island. This is a closer view of the lower tip of Manhattan and Upper New York Bay, with Ellis Island, Governor's Island and Liberty Island. The Statue of Liberty is on Liberty Island.
Recommended videos. New York City.
Recommended video, Here Grows New York.
Recommended video, History of New York City. Recommended video, The History of New York in 12 minutes.
Recommended video, What's Left of New Amsterdam and the Origins of the USA.
Recommended video, George Washington's defeat in New York.
Recommended video, The Simple Genius of New York City's water supply system.
Recommended video, a closer look at New York City's water supply. Recommended video, the Port of New York and New Jersey. Recommended video, the Erie Canal.
Recommended video, New York City draft riots of 1863. Recommended video, Modern Marvels, Building the Brooklyn Bridge.
Recommended video, America's first mega project, The Amazing Story of the Brooklyn Bridge.
Recommended video, The City of Greater New York. The Story of Consolidation.
Recommended video, How did the boroughs of New York get their names?
Recommended video, Top 10 Best Places to Visit in Manhattan, New York. Manhattan Travel Guide. Recommended video, Top 10 Things to Do in Manhattan.
Recommended video, to 10 Things to Do in Brooklyn.
Recommended video, 9 Best Things to Do in Queens. Recommended video, Top-rated attractions and things to do in the Bronx.
Recommended video, Top 7 Things to Do in Staten Island, New York City's unexpected gem. Recommended video, Top 10 Largest U.S. Cities by Population, 1790 to 2017. Recommended video, Biggest U.S. Cities, 1776 to 2035.
Recommended video, Top 15 Most Populated Cities in the World, 1700 to 2019.
Recommended video, YouTube navigation.
Recommended videos. Walking tours of New York City. For a street-level experience of New York City. View the video walking tours. It's the next best thing to being there.
Recommended videos, New York City Walking Tour playlist. Recommended video, New York City Walking Tour by New York Tour 1. Part 1, Midtown Manhattan.
Recommended video, New York City Walking Tour by New York Tour 1. Part 2, Downtown Manhattan. Recommended video, New York City Virtual Walking Tour. Midtown Manhattan New York City Walk. Hudson Yards and Midtown West. Recommended video, Driving Downtown, New York City.
Recommended video, New York City's Financial District Walking Tour. Recommended video, New York City 4K Walking Tour. Downtown Manhattan. One World Trade Center to South Street Seaport. Recommended video, New York City Walking Tour 4K. Fifth Avenue. Sunset Walk. Recommended video, New York City Walking Tour. Times Square. New York City, Table of Contents.
Thanks for watching. This is continued in Part 3.